The narrative opens not in the light of day, but deep within the echoing, climate-controlled silence of government and corporate archives. This is the ultimate sanctum of preserved truth, a labyrinth of steel shelving stretching into dim infinity, where the temperature is kept rigidly low and the humidity carefully calibrated to inhibit the slow, destructive march of time. Yet, despite the meticulous preservation, time acts here as the ultimate censor, ensuring that certain truths, certain crucial data points, only emerge long after their moment of relevance has passed. We are tracing 5 specific documents, artifacts of critical failure, whose intentional or accidental delay reshaped global outcomes, etching scars onto the collective memory that now define historical turning points rather than avoidable crises. They are heavy, yellowed files, often brittle to the touch, locked away behind cold, reinforced steel cabinet doors. Their paper smelling faintly of ozone, dust, and profoundly forgotten consequence. The archive, in its vast subterranean reach, is itself a monument to selective memory. A place where the sound of a lone trolley rolling across the polished concrete floor reverberates with the solemnity of a cathedral bell. The light here is soft, filtered, intended to protect the delicate fibers of aging pulp, casting long, ambiguous shadows across rows of identical gray boxes. It is within this controlled environment that the first file rests, designated by a numeric code known only to a tight circle of security professionals and historians specializing in disaster forensics. This is the document detailing systemic structural flaws in a vital defense system. A complex, sprawling network designed to safeguard crucial national infrastructure against both external threat and internal failure. The report, dated nearly 7 pivotal years before its eventual quiet surfacing, was meticulously coded. It was printed on thin, onion skin paper, designed for immediate, secure transmission and swift destruction after reading, giving it a ghost-like transparency. The ink, though sharp and machine-printed, seemed to float just above the surface of the paper. This was not a generalized warning. It was a granular, almost surgical analysis of metallurgy fatigue in 3 critical nodes, detailing the specific resonant frequencies that would induce catastrophic failure under specific, foreseeable operational stress. The exact stress conditions the system was routinely designed to handle. The analyst who compiled it had included complex charts charting the exponential decay curve of the materials, predicting a failure window with chilling accuracy. 7 years. 7 years during which the system was routinely operated, maintained superficially, and relied upon absolutely. 7 years during which the report remained sealed, classified above all but the highest clearances, hidden from the engineers whose hands were directly on the controls, and from the procurement teams who could have initiated a mandatory overhaul. The delay was attributed, years later, to a tangle of interdepartmental jurisdiction disputes and a paralyzing fear of budgetary overruns. The cost of prevention, deemed politically unpalatable, was silently deferred. The eventual surfacing of the coded report arrived only after the catastrophic failure it predicted had already occurred. It was not revealed in a burst of transparency, but slowly extracted during the grim, exhaustive investigation that followed the collapse. The failure was instant, total, and spectacular, reducing a massive, multi-billion credit asset to twisted wreckage spread across miles of terrain. The immediate aftermath was marked by the haunting, high-pitched whine of generators powering emergency searchlights, cutting through the heavy midnight air. The scene was dominated by the acrid smell of burnt wiring, scorched earth, and leaked hydraulic fluids. The searchlights glinted coldly off the fragmented metal, highlighting the specific shear points and stress fractures that precisely matched the diagrams in the 7-year-old report. When the report finally achieved public visibility, it served only as a tragic footnote, a painful "I told you so" etched into the historical record. Its data was no longer actionable intelligence, it was forensic confirmation. The engineers who finally read the meticulously coded warnings did so seated in temporary trailers erected near the edge of the exclusion zone, surrounded by the constant thrum of heavy salvage machinery. They handled the onion skin paper with a reverence born of profound regret, realizing that the knowledge contained within had held the power to save lives and trillions in capital. Now it was merely an explanation for the cold, unforgiving wreckage that lay visible outside their trailer windows. The damage was etched onto the landscape, permanent and undeniable, and the 7-year delay had sealed its necessity. The second document emerges from a different sort of archive entirely, the polished, hushed world of corporate legal preservation. This is the internal study, stamped in aggressive red ink. Privileged, destroy upon reading. It relates to a lucrative chemical compound, marketed globally and integrated into countless consumer goods, offering extraordinary profit margins to the holding conglomerate. This file, unlike the first, does not concern immediate structural collapse, but the slow, calculated erosion of public health. Physically, the document is a heavy binder, its vinyl cover slightly scuffed from decades spent stacked beneath quarterly financial reports in a climate-controlled vault specifically designed to defeat discovery.
It is bound with heavy-duty black plastic combs, and the paper within is glossy, almost reflecting the overhead light, a testament to its expensive internal production.
The report's contents outline the calculated risk to public safety regarding the compound's long-term toxicity. It utilized cold, sterile language, acceptable attrition rate, tolerable subclinical effects, and projected liability threshold. Crucially, it detailed the mechanism by which the chemical, initially deemed inert, would slowly accumulate within human tissue, initiating irreversible harm only after years of latent exposure. Long past the point of initial diagnosis or successful litigation, the calculated decision made decades earlier was simple. The immediate profits far outweighed the distant theoretical cost of litigation years down the line. The document was meticulously buried, not shredded, but absorbed into the deep, dark well of corporate secrecy, shielded by layers of legal privilege and non-disclosure agreements. It lay dormant while the chemical compound saturated markets globally, while millions of individuals were unknowingly exposed. While the first faint, confounding symptoms began to surface in various corners of the world. The decades passed, marked by the slow, painful realization of the affected population. Diagnoses were often vague. Doctors struggled to link the chronic, debilitating illnesses to a common factor, and the affected individuals faced medical uncertainty and mounting financial despair. They suffered neurological deterioration, systemic inflammation, and a profound, life-altering reduction in vitality. The corporation, meanwhile, fought every early lawsuit with overwhelming legal force, relying on the absence of a smoking gun, the internal study, to maintain the narrative of product safety. The truth finally emerged into the harsh, uncompromising glare of a courtroom sun. It was pulled into existence not by corporate conscience, but by the relentless, often sacrificial efforts of a handful of specialized investigative journalists and tenacious public interest lawyers. When the binder was finally introduced as Exhibit A, the contrast between its sterile, glossy surface and the profound human suffering it represented was jarring. The presiding judge handled the file, its edges brittle, smelling faintly of old paper, and the specific sterile scent of a vault, with visible shock. The study proved every claim the victims had made. It demonstrated that the company had known, almost to the day,
when the latent effects would manifest. Yet decades had been lost. The courtroom battle, though victorious for the victims, yielded only monetary compensation and an official acknowledgement of guilt. The irreversible harm, the decades of pain, the lost function, the truncated lives, could not be undone by a favorable verdict or a press conference. The document, once a potential preemptive safeguard for public health, had been downgraded to a painful instrument of retrospective justice, emerging long after the affected population had suffered irreversible harm that no amount of settlement money could truly remedy. It provided context for the tragedy, but zero means of prevention or cure. A third file resides within the stately, somewhat pretentious archives of the Capitol's Central Governance Building.
The walls here are lined with bark, weighty mahogany, and the air carries a faint, persistent scent of ancient sealant and highly polished brass.
This is the repository of political decisions, where paper is often sealed behind ornate, heavy governmental doors. And access is governed by complex layers of protocol, designed more for obfuscation than preservation. This particular file contains the searing, handwritten testimony of a whistleblowing analyst. It is bound not with common staples, but with thick, dark red ribbon tied with an official government seal, wax now cracked and brittle with age. The text itself is powerful, written rapidly in dark blue ink that shows the determined pressure of the pen. It details with painstaking precision a high-level funding diversion, a systematic siphoning of trillions of credits intended for the maintenance and modernization of critical, aging urban infrastructure. The analyst's warnings focused on the interconnected nature of the system, the immense subterranean network of water pipes, the brittle, century-old power conduits, and the vast, neglected network of road and rail tunnels threading beneath the metropolis. The report stated plainly that deferred maintenance was not merely an inconvenience, it was a ticking clock. The analyst provided statistical models showing that within a decade, failure in one area, such as the main pump stations, would cascade into systemic collapse across the entire urban artery system. The testimony urged immediate, emergency reallocation of resources, detailing the specific, dire consequences of inaction. Mass water failure, widespread power outages, and the utter paralysis of metropolitan transport. The testimony was immediately classified and sealed. The analyst, facing the customary retaliation, was quietly removed from their post and discredited. The powerful interests benefiting from the funding diversion ensured the file was locked away, effectively silenced behind the thick, sound-dampening, ornate governmental doors. The decade passed in slow motion, punctuated by minor, increasingly frequent outages that were dismissed publicly as anomalies or temporary strains. Then, the predicted collapse occurred. It was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding cessation of function that utterly paralyzed the capital. First, the water pressure dropped, leaving millions without potable water, followed swiftly by major bursts in the antique piping, flooding crucial subterranean power nodes. The power grid, under sudden localized stress, failed in sequence, plunging entire urban sectors into darkness. The subsequent transport crisis, with major tunnels blocked by structural collapses and flooded thoroughfares, sealed the city's fate. The sensory details of the collapse were immediate and visceral. The smell of chlorine and stagnant water mixed with the faint, metallic scent of overheating electrical conduits. The once constant soundscape of the urban environment, the perpetual hum of machinery, the roar of traffic, was replaced by an unnerving, heavy silence, broken only by the sporadic cries of emergency sirens and the slow drip of water onto abandoned concrete. The handwritten testimony was released from its sealed confinement only after the infrastructure crisis had utterly collapsed, leaving whole urban sectors paralyzed and abandoned. It was unearthed by emergency oversight committees trying to map the disaster and allocate blame.
When retrieved, the ribbon was carefully cut. The brittle wax seal crumbled. The urgent handwriting, once a vital warning, now looked like an epitaph. Remediation costs were estimated at 10 times the original preventative budget. The document provided the devastating roadmap of neglect, confirming that every structural fracture, every flooded basement, and every paralyzed neighborhood had been explicitly foreseen and consciously ignored. The document was no longer an analyst's urgent plea, but an archaeological record of societal failure. The fourth document, bound with thick official red tape that felt coarse and dry to the touch, represents the betrayal of scientific prescience. This file is found in a university-affiliated research archive, less about secrecy and more about political indifference and the sheer discomfort of facing inconvenient, long-term truth. The archive room smells faintly of ozone and old paper, a sterile contrast to the natural forces the document describes. The file is heavy, filled with intricate scientific graphs, predictive models, and hydrological data. It charts the early, accelerated trajectory of a major environmental catastrophe, the inevitable and measurable rise in sea levels caused by irreversible changes to global climate systems. Compiled by a consortium of leading geologists and climate scientists, the report meticulously detailed the feedback loops, the specific thermal expansion rates, and the point at which coastal protective measures would become mathematically futile. It identified specific coastal regions, dense, low-lying human settlements, and provided a precise decade-by-decade timeline for inundation. The scientists, through their intricate charting and careful data points, had identified the critical window for strategic retreat, massive global reallocation of populations, and the construction of monumental, proactive defenses. The complexity of the information, however, became its own defense mechanism for those seeking inaction. The graphs, filled with S-curves, exponential trajectories, and complex color coding, were too inconveniently complex for rapid political consumption. They demanded difficult, immediate decisions that required sacrificing short-term economic growth for long-term survival. The political system chose to delay, obfuscate, and demand further review, effectively binding the critical data in layers of bureaucratic red tape. The report remained sealed, not necessarily classified, but effectively shelved, deemed premature or alarmist for decades. During that time, the coastal regions identified in the report continued to develop, building new infrastructure, attracting further populations, effectively compounding the coming disaster. The scientific prediction evolved through inaction into geological inevitability. The document became public only when the coastal regions it described were already struggling against the relentless, encroaching tide. The scene of the document's emergence contrasts sharply with its dry academic contents. It was studied not in air-conditioned labs, but in makeshift command centers established on the fragile, retreating land. Windows occasionally streaked with salt spray. The sound was dominated by the dull, rhythmic impact of massive waves against hastily constructed seawalls, and the roar of pumps struggling vainly against the perpetual ingress of seawater. The data charts, with their lines tracing the rise of the sea surface, were now chillingly familiar to the local engineers who were living the reality the scientists had modeled decades prior. They could trace the current high watermark directly back to a specific data point on a graph that was over 20 years old. The red tape that had bound the document had become brittle and faded, but the consequences it predicted were now brutally fresh. The scientific graphs, once intended to guide preventative action, now served as historical maps of lost territory. They offered no remediation, only explanation for the houses collapsing into the surf, the infrastructure dissolving under hydrostatic pressure, and the vast humanitarian crisis of internal displacement.
The weight of the brine-soaked air seemed to press down on the brittle paper, confirming that human political time had been utterly defeated by the accelerating, unforgiving pace of planetary dynamics.
The final artifact addresses a crisis that is profoundly human and brutally immediate, yet equally subject to the lethality of bureaucratic delay. This is a logistics memo, stark in its simplicity and chilling in its dry, quantitative language. It concerns severe resource misallocation in a critical humanitarian zone, an isolated region grappling with crop failure, conflict-induced displacement, and the resulting severe food insecurity. The memo, generated by mid-level field coordinators, is devoid of emotional commentary, sticking strictly to data. Tonnage required, caloric output necessary for minimum survival, operational capacity of transport routes, and estimated mortality rates based on supply line failure. It detailed how critical aid shipments were being intentionally diverted or delayed by central coordination bodies, driven by political expediency and conflicting internal mandates. It warned that if the scheduled supplies did not reach the designated subregions within a 6-week window, the mortality projections would move from concerning to catastrophic, initiating a terminal famine cycle. Like the others, this memo was filed, circulated to the highest echelons of the coordinating body, and ultimately ignored. The delay was measured not in years or decades, but in critical weeks and months. A blink of an eye in governmental time, but an eternity in human survival time. The document was pushed aside amidst endless meetings focused on optimizing public image, internal power struggles, and securing future funding by avoiding messy, immediate action. The famine cycle, inevitable once the 6-week window closed, ran its terrible course. It was marked by the silence of cessation, the silence of markets shuttered, the silence of cooking fires unlit, the profound, unearthly silence of a humanitarian zone that had lost its demographic future. The logistical memo, with its sterile charts and numerical breakdowns of necessary calories, finally saw the light of day long after the famine it sought to prevent had completed its terrible, irreversible cycle. It was released not as an act of saving grace, but as an embarrassing leak during a post-mortem inquiry. Historians and aid workers studied it later, tracing the lines on the map that showed the trucks that never arrived and the warehouses that stood deliberately empty. The document confirmed the tragedy was not an act of nature, but an act of systematic, calculated administrative failure. It provided a perfect map of the misallocation, confirming the exact date upon which the point of no return had been knowingly crossed. Its emergence did nothing to save the lost generations, nor did it alleviate the grief of the survivors. It merely added a layer of cold, factual certainty to the immense human toll. The document itself, often retrieved from temporary field-based archives, was thin, dusty, smelling faintly of dry earth and bureaucracy. It stands as perhaps the most tragic of the 5, a brief administrative note that, through delay, became a detailed account of mass preventable death. These 5 documents, the coded field report, the privileged corporate study, the searing handwritten testimony, the tape-bound scientific graphs, and the logistics memo, share a silent, profound weight. They are not merely papers. They are monuments to a history that could have been avoided. Their vital data, now purely academic. Each emerged from the bureaucratic shadows years or even decades past its actionable moment, offering context but zero remedy for the damage etched onto the global landscape. They confirm that the greatest tragedies of modern society often do not stem from a lack of information, but from a deliberate or negligent failure to act upon it in time. The archive, in its pristine, climate-controlled silence, becomes a graveyard of foresight. The paper, preserved indefinitely, mocks the fleeting nature of the opportunity it once represented. The Defense System Report now teaches forensic engineers how to identify complex failure modes, but the massive wreck remains. The corporate study now aids lawyers in calculating damages, but the victims carry their irreversible harm. The whistleblower's testimony is studied by urban planners to understand the dynamics of decay, but the abandoned city sectors remain scar tissue. The environmental graphs are used by climatologists to validate their models, while the tides continue their slow, relentless encroachment. And the logistical memo sits in databases, a sterile reference point for future disaster planning, unable to resurrect the souls lost to willful administrative apathy. The true weight of these documents is felt in the chilling distinction between knowing and acting. They transitioned from being instruments of potential salvation to artifacts of historical failure.
As they rest on the archival shelves, preserved in the controlled environment of dust and faded ink, they whisper a constant, collective truth.
The hardest thing to change is not the trajectory of an airplane, a city, or a tide, but the entrenched inertial resistance of human systems, which ensures that some truths are always released too late to matter. They stand as enduring evidence that time, when weaponized by bureaucracy and self-interest, ensures that the price of knowledge deferred is always, inevitably, paid in full. The cold silence of the archive is heavy with the echo of global consequences that could have been merely averted footnotes.